Good evening. A child is sitting on a porch step in rural Georgia. The year is 1903. The morning is warm and thick, the kind of southern morning that smells of red clay and old wood, and around her the world is alive. The chickens scratch at the dirt. A dog moves through the tall grass at the edge of the yard. The fields stretch out cold and trembling in the early heat. She should be running. She should be loud. She is 7 years old, and she is completely still. Her skin is the color of old candle wax. Her belly is swollen, gently, like something quietly filling from inside. Her eyes, when a traveler passes on the dirt road and looks up at her, are open, but they are somewhere else entirely, glassy, vacant. The traveler shakes his head and moves on. He will tell people later, in the way that people tell things when they think they understand, that the children of the rural South have a quality about them, a particular and inexcusable laziness, a moral failing inherited, bred into the character of a people. He is wrong. He is catastrophically, tragically, historically wrong. What that child is carrying in the lining of her small intestine, attached to the soft tissue of her gut, like dozens of tiny, patient mouths, is not laziness. It is not poor breeding. It is not the consequence of a broken culture. It is a parasite, and it has been feeding on her, quietly, for months. Before we continue, if these slow journeys into the forgotten corners of history help you rest, take a moment to like and subscribe before you close your eyes. That way, there will always be somewhere quiet to return to when the night is long. Drop a comment with your location and the time where you are. I love knowing how far this reaches. But now, dim the lights a little more, set your phone face down, and let us begin. There is a kind of cruelty that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a sword or a proclamation. It does not burn or shout. It simply settles, the way fog settles into low-lying ground, quietly, completely, until the landscape has been changed and no one remembers what it looked like before. The cruelty we are concerned with tonight arrived in the American South over centuries, and it wore the face of a judgment. The judgment said, "These people are lazy," to understand what that meant, to understand the weight and the reach and the damage of those 3 words. You have to go back to the South that existed at the turn of the 20th century. Not the South of textbooks or of political speeches. The actual South, the one made of dirt roads and split-rail fences and farmhouses with no glass in the windows. The one where a family might own 40 acres of cotton and still not have enough money to buy their children shoes. The one where summer arrived in April and didn't leave until October, where the humidity pressed on you like a second skin, where the soil was red and warm and alive with things that most people never thought to look at. This was a South still deep in the shadow of the Civil War, still bleeding from a wound that had never properly closed. The war had ended in 1865, but for millions of poor Southerners, white sharecroppers and black tenant farmers alike, the peace that followed was not much gentler than the war itself. The plantation economy had collapsed, but what replaced it, for the poorest, was not opportunity. It was the same exhausting cycle of debt, only now without even the terrible stability of slavery to organize it. Sharecroppers gave up half their harvest to landlords in exchange for seed and tools, then found themselves at year's end further in debt than when they had started. The cotton prices dropped, the soil thinned, the debts compounded, and the people, generation after generation, stayed poor. Poor in a way that is difficult to describe if you have not lived it. Not merely without money, but without the basic architecture of a dignified life. Rural cabins with dirt floors, or floors made of rough-hewn pine boards with gaps wide enough to see through. No running water, no indoor sanitation. A wooden outhouse, if you were lucky. If you were not lucky, the fields behind the house. Children who owned one pair of shoes, if any, and wore them only to church on Sunday. The rest of the week, bare feet, in the yard, on the dirt paths between fields and houses, in the soft, warm, perpetually moist earth of the southern summer. This last detail, hold it, because the South's great misfortune was not only its poverty, though the poverty was profound. It was the intersection of that poverty with a climate and a landscape that were unknowingly perfect for something that no one had yet thought to look for. The American South, humid, warm, abundant in rainfall, rich with the particular kind of soil that holds moisture, was, for a specific kind of microscopic organism, paradise. But that comes later. First, we have to sit with what the outside world saw. What the outside world saw was lethargy. Visitors from the north, journalists, politicians, the occasional academic. They came down to the South in the 1880s and 1890s and the early years of the new century, and they looked and they wrote what they saw. They saw people moving slowly. They saw children who sat rather than played, who stared rather than learned, who grew up pale and thin-limbed and seemingly incapable of the vigor that the age demanded. They saw adults who could not keep pace with the agricultural output of farms in the Midwest or the Northeast. They saw a region that seemed, by every external measure, to be falling behind, and they reached, with remarkable confidence, for the most comfortable explanation available to them. Character. It was, they said, a matter of character, of breeding, of some essential quality that the Southern poor, across race, across county lines, across generations, simply lacked. Northern newspapers ran editorials about the laziness of the Southern rural poor, with the calm certainty of people who have never thought to question their own observations. Politicians spoke of the backwards South. Social reformers wrung their hands about poor white families and poor black families alike, and concluded that what was needed was more discipline, more industry, more moral fiber. None of them, not one, thought to look at the soil. The term that eventually attached itself to the condition was first used in the early press reports after Charles Wardell Stiles began his investigations, the germ of laziness. And even that phrase, when it entered popular circulation, was used mockingly. A germ causing laziness. The newspapers of New York and Boston printed it as comedy. The idea that what looked like sloth was actually sickness, that an entire region's reputation had been forged in part by a microscopic parasite, seemed to the educated and well-fed readers of the industrialized North simply absurd. It is not absurd. It is the literal truth. And before this night is over, you will understand exactly how it happened. But let us stay, for a moment, in that earlier world, in the world before the diagnosis. Consider what the stereotype cost. A stereotype, once settled into the national imagination, does not merely describe, it prescribes. It becomes the lens through which everything is seen. If the southern rural poor are lazy by nature, then their poverty is their own fault. Their thin children are the result of poor choices, not poor health. Their inability to read or write or progress economically is a function of inferior character, not of a biological reality that is actively dismantling their capacity to think, to grow, to be well. If the problem is character, you do not need doctors. You do not need medicine. You do not need public health campaigns or sanitation infrastructure. You need perhaps a sermon, a lecture on the virtues of hard work, maybe a school if you are feeling generous. The stereotype, in other words, made the disease invisible. It gave everyone who might have helped a reason not to look. And so the worm fed on, undisturbed. The American South in 1900 was a place of almost unimaginable ecological complexity when it came to human disease. The same warm climate, the same standing water, the same moist earth, the same absence of sanitation infrastructure that made the South beautiful also made it hospitable to a gallery of parasitic and infectious threats that were, by that point, largely absent from the industrializing North. Malaria was common across large swaths of the region. Pellagra, caused by severe niacin deficiency, was widespread among those whose diets consisted almost entirely of corn. Typhoid moved through communities that shared wells and lacked privies. The poor southern body was under assault from multiple directions simultaneously, and most of those assaults went unnamed, untreated, and misunderstood. Into this landscape, already burdened, already struggling, already wearing the brand of laziness that the rest of the country had pressed upon it, the hookworm had been moving, quietly and without announcement, for 2 centuries or more. How it arrived is a story worth pausing on, because it tells you something about the deep roots of the damage. Medical historians and parasitologists are broadly in agreement that Necator Americanus, the species of hookworm that would eventually be identified as the primary culprit in the American South, almost certainly arrived in the New World aboard the ships of the Atlantic slave trade, beginning in the 17th century. West Africa, from which the majority of enslaved people were taken, was and remains a region where hookworm infection is endemic. The parasite was there in the bodies of the people who were stolen and transported. When those people were brought to the humid, warm, barefoot farming world of the American South, the ecological conditions for the parasite's continued survival were more than adequate. The worm had found a new home, and over the following centuries, it spread, slowly, invisibly, in the soil and feces of a population that had no idea it was there. The enslaved people who carried it did not choose to bring it. They did not know it was there. They were themselves its victims, as surely as every generation of Southerner who walked barefoot through warm soil afterward. The origin of the hookworm's presence in America is like so much of American history, a story that runs directly through the violence of slavery. And that detail matters because it means the parasite was, from the beginning, woven into the deepest inequities of the society it inhabited. By the time the Civil War ended and the long grinding poverty of the post-Reconstruction South set in, the hookworm had decades, perhaps a century, of quiet establishment behind it. It was in the fields, it was in the yards, it was in the dirt paths between the cabins. It was, almost certainly, in the soil of every county in every state, from Virginia down through Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana. Everywhere the conditions were right, which was everywhere that was warm and moist and without proper sanitation. And the people of those counties walked barefoot on it every day. They did not know. Why would they? The entry point, the moment when a hookworm larva first penetrates the skin, produces little more than a faint itch, a mild redness between the toes that locals called ground itch and attributed to the soil itself. It was not painful. It did not look like an invasion. It looked like a small irritation, the kind that fades in a day or two. And by the time it faded, the larva was already gone, already moving through the bloodstream, toward the lungs, toward the intestine, toward its quiet and permanent residence inside the human body. The damage came later, slowly, cumulatively, in the months and years that followed as the worms attached and fed. The symptoms accumulated in a way that was easy to mistake for almost anything else, for malnutrition, for poor genetics, for an indefinable constitutional weakness. The skin grew pale, the energy diminished. The belly, in children especially, began to swell. The appetite changed. Some children began eating dirt compulsively, a behavior called pica that physicians of the era attributed to strange habits or weak-mindedness, not understanding that a body robbed of iron will search for it anywhere, even in the earth. And the mind grew slow. Not permanently, not irreversibly, but in the way that a fire grows slow when someone keeps stealing its wood. Quietly, gradually, until where there had been brightness, there was only a dull, persistent fog. The traveler on that Georgian dirt road saw the fog. He named it laziness. He moved on. He never thought to ask what was inside the child, but someone would. Eventually, someone patient enough and stubborn enough and scientifically trained enough to look at the South not with the eyes of a moralist, but with the eyes of a man who understood that the body does not lie, and that when an entire population is sick in the same way, there is a reason. That man was not yet known. He was, at that moment, in the early years of the new century, quietly collecting samples in the red clay counties of the South, carrying his microscope and his growing conviction through a landscape that did not yet know it needed saving. What lived in the soil beneath the bare feet of the South, what it looked like, how it worked, how it fed, how it survived for years inside the human body without ever being detected. That is where we go next. The monster, when you see it clearly, is more precise and more terrible than anything the imagination conjures. It was not dramatic, it was patient. And patience, in a parasite, as in so many things, is the most dangerous quality of all. Let us talk about the worm, not in the language of alarm, not with the breathless urgency that sensational histories tend to reach for when they encounter something genuinely horrifying. Let us talk about it the way a naturalist might, with precision, with patience, with the kind of calm that comes from understanding that nature is not malevolent. It is simply indifferent. And indifference, when it wears the face of something this elegant and this relentless, has a horror all its own. Necator Americanus, the American murderer. That is its taxonomic name, the name that Charles Wardell Stiles gave it when he identified it as a distinct species in 1901. And the name has always struck me as unusually candid for the language of science. Most parasites are named for their discoverers, or for their geography, or for some obscure Latin descriptor of their shape or behavior. This one was named for what it does, the American murderer, not a dramatic, sudden killer. Nothing so obvious as that. A slow one, a patient one, a killer that works across months and years through subtraction rather than addition, removing something vital from its host one small measure at a time, until the host is hollowed. To understand how it does this, you have to begin at the beginning, and the beginning is the soil. The female hookworm, living in the warmth of a human intestine, lays eggs. Not a few eggs. Between 5,000 and 10,000 eggs every single day. These eggs are oval, thin-shelled, almost transparent, so small that you would need a microscope to see them clearly. And even then they look like nothing more than modest little ovals, impossibly unremarkable for the damage they carry. They leave the body in feces, and if the feces reaches soil, warm soil, moist soil, the kind of dark, sheltered earth found beneath the trees at the edge of a southern field, or along the path between a cabin and the well, the eggs hatch within 24 to 48 hours. What emerges is the first stage larva. It is rhabditiform, a word that means little more than that. It is rod-shaped, slightly thicker at one end than the other, small enough to disappear between grains of soil. It feeds on bacteria. It moves through the earth in the way that very small things move through soft matter, not swimming, not crawling, but threading, finding the spaces between particles and negotiating them. It molts. It grows into a second stage larva, still feeding, still small, still invisible. And then, after perhaps 5 to 10 days in the soil, it molts again. This third molt is the transformation that matters. What emerges is the falariform larva, the infective stage. It is longer now, more slender, built not to feed, but to wait. It has exhausted its ability to take nutrients from the soil. It cannot eat in this form. It has only a fixed reserve of energy, and it will spend that reserve slowly, patiently, waiting in the thin upper layer of the earth, in the shadow of grass, at the edges of footpaths, in the warm, humid spaces between clods of clay, for something warm to walk by. This is where we must pause and simply hold the image for a moment. A creature smaller than a thread of fine sewing silk, standing upright in the soil, swaying. It cannot see. It cannot hear. It responds to warmth and moisture and the faint chemical signals of breath and skin. It is, in every sense of the word, waiting. It has evolved over millions of years to do exactly this one thing. To wait at the interface between the earth and the air, for a living body to come close enough. In rural Georgia in 1903, living bodies come close constantly, all day long. Children running in the yard in the morning, a mother hanging laundry, bare feet in the damp earth behind the cabin, a man walking the path from the fields to the creek, the path worn smooth by years of bare feet, the soil along its edges rich and dark, and kept perpetually moist by shade and by the habits of a family with no outhouse. Bare feet everywhere, bare feet pressing into the warm ground, and in that ground thousands of invisible threads of patient hunger. The moment of contact is nothing. That is perhaps the cruelest part of it. A slight tingling between the toes. A faint itch, maybe. The locals called it ground itch or dew itch, and it came and went so commonly in summer that no one gave it much thought. What they did not know was that the tingling was the sensation of a larva dissolving its way through the outer layer of the skin, secreting enzymes that loosen the protein bonds of the stratum corneum, finding the gap between cells, slipping inward. From that point, the journey is swift and it is extraordinary. The larva enters the bloodstream almost immediately, not through a vein it punctures, but through the capillary-rich dermis, where blood is always near the surface. It is swept up by the circulation, carried inward, moving through the veins toward the right side of the heart. The heart pumps it forward, into the pulmonary circulation, into the tiny capillaries of the lungs, where it does something that still strikes me, every time I read it, as almost architectural in its audacity. It breaks out. The larva ruptures the wall of the lung capillary and enters the air sac, the alveoles, directly. It is now inside the lung itself, breathing space, surrounded not by blood, but by air. It has crossed from the circulatory system into the respiratory system by simply pushing through the wall between them, and then it begins to move upward. The lungs have a cleaning mechanism, the mucociliary escalator, millions of tiny hair-like cilia that beat constantly upward, moving a thin layer of mucus toward the throat, carrying debris with it. The larva rides this escalator up through the bronchioles, up through the bronchi, up through the trachea, until it reaches the back of the throat, where the swallowing reflex takes over, and it is swallowed down the esophagus, into the stomach, through the stomach into the small intestine. Here, at last, it has arrived where it was always going. The small intestine is where the adult worm will spend the rest of its life, which may be 3 years or 5, or in some documented cases as long as 10. It molts twice more during its first weeks in the gut, developing its final adult form. The males are roughly 7 to 9 millimeters long, the females slightly larger, 9 to 11. In the context of the human body, they are tiny, barely longer than a fingernail is wide. But in the context of what they do, they are enormous. The mouth of Necator Americanus, its buccal capsule, as parasitologists call it, is equipped with 4 cutting plates, 2 dorsal and 2 ventral, arranged in a roughly circular pattern at the worm's anterior end. These are not teeth in any familiar sense. They are hard, chitinous blades, curved slightly inward like the edges of a trap. The worm uses them the way a pair of scissors would be used on soft fabric, pressing against the mucosal lining of the intestine, cutting, and then creating suction with its muscular esophagus to pull a small plug of living tissue into its mouth. The tissue it seizes includes blood vessels. Small arterioles and venules rupture at the attachment site. Blood flows, and the worm ensures that blood continues to flow by releasing anticoagulants, compounds that block the body's clotting cascade, that prevent the wound from sealing, that keep the hemorrhage at the attachment site open and available. The worm drinks some of this blood directly. Some escapes past the worm's mouth and leaks into the intestinal space. And then the worm moves, slightly, constantly, detaching and reattaching along the intestinal wall, leaving behind a trail of small bleeding wounds that cannot close because the anticoagulant is still present in the tissue. Each individual Necator Americanus steals on average 0.03 milliliters of blood per day through direct ingestion. But the blood lost through leakage around the attachment site is considerably greater. In heavy infections, the total blood loss per worm can exceed 1 full milliliter per day. Now multiply that by 100 worms, or 200. In a heavily infected person, and heavily infected people were not rare in the rural South of the early 20th century, the daily blood loss could be equivalent to losing a teaspoon of blood every single day from a small wound deep inside the body that never closed and never stopped. Consider what that means over months, over years. The body requires iron to build hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is what carries oxygen in the blood. When iron is lost faster than it can be replaced through diet, and in the diet of the rural southern poor, which consisted largely of cornmeal, salt pork, and molasses, iron was already scarce. The body begins to fall behind. First, the iron stores deplete. Then the production of hemoglobin slows. The red blood cells become fewer and smaller and paler. Oxygen delivery to every tissue in the body begins to decrease. This is anemia, and in its chronic form, it is not a dramatic emergency. It is a slow dimming, a gradual withdrawal of the body's most fundamental fuel. The skin loses its color, not dramatically, not all at once, but over months of accumulation. The complexion becomes pale, almost waxy, carrying that particular translucence that severe anemia produces. The eyes take on a glassy quality. The irises still vivid, but the surrounding tissue pale where blood should give it color. The body begins to redirect what little oxygen it has away from the periphery and toward the vital organs, which means the extremities grow cold, the muscles grow weak, the capacity for sustained effort, for the work of a farm, for the concentration of a classroom, for anything requiring the sustained expenditure of energy, diminishes. The belly. In children especially, the belly swells, not from fat, from edema, from the protein loss that accumulates alongside the blood loss, causing fluid to leak from the circulation into the abdominal cavity, and the shoulder blades as the child hunches forward with the persistent low-grade abdominal discomfort that heavy worm burden produces, begin to protrude. This was what observers of the era described, with a phrase that I find both vivid and devastating, as angel wings, the sharp, bony triangles of scapulae, pressing through the skin of a malnourished, anemic child's back. The fish-eye stare. That phrase, too, appears in contemporary accounts. The particular quality of gaze that severe anemia and cognitive impairment produces. The eyes open but unfocused, the attention somewhere distant, the face carrying the expression of someone listening to something no one else can hear. In adults, this was read as stupidity. In children, it was read as slowness, as unteachability, as confirmation of the inherited inadequacy that the stereotypes of the era had already decided must be there. What it actually was, what the fish-eye stare and the angel wings and the pale skin and the swollen belly and the sitting still on the porch step in the middle of a summer morning that should have been full of noise and running. What all of it actually was a child whose brain was not receiving enough oxygen to function at its capacity. Not because she was damaged, not because she was inferior, because something was attached to the wall of her gut and it was drinking, and the iron her body needed to carry oxygen to her developing brain was being systematically removed from her, one microscopic measure at a time, every day, without pause, while she slept, and while she sat in the schoolroom, and while she sat on that porch step, and while she stared at the traveler on the dirt road who looked back at her and thought, laziness and the dirt eating. We must speak of the dirt eating. It was one of the most widely noted behaviors of heavily infected populations in the rural South, and it was one of the most widely mocked. Children who ate dirt. Adults seen gnawing at clay banks along roadsides. Physicians and reformers writing about it with a mixture of disgust and condescension, as evidence of the primitive habits of the rural poor, as proof of cultural degradation. The medical term for it is pica, the compulsive consumption of non-food substances, particularly soil or clay. And it was, in this population, almost certainly a response to iron deficiency. The body, starved of iron by the worms draining its blood, was reaching for whatever source of minerals was immediately available. It was not a choice. It was not a habit. It was a biological imperative, the body's desperate attempt to solve a problem it could not name, searching in the earth for what the earth's parasite had taken. Charles Stiles, when he was conducting his early surveys of the South, saw people eating dirt and recognized it immediately as a clinical sign of profound anemia, a body in genuine nutritional crisis. The newspapers, when they heard about it, used it as evidence that Southerners were strange and primitive. These are two entirely different ways of looking at the same phenomenon, and the distance between them is the distance between compassion and contempt. The hookworm did not only steal blood, it stole the future. A child infected heavily enough and early enough in development sustained damage that was cumulative and reinforcing. The cognitive impairment that came with chronic anemia was real, measurable, documented, the result of an oxygen-starved brain failing to form the neural connections that learning requires. A child who cannot concentrate cannot learn to read. A child who cannot read cannot progress through school. A child who does not progress through school enters adulthood without the literacy and numeracy that determine economic possibility. And that child grows up and has children of her own in the same warm soil, with the same bare feet, and the cycle begins again. Persistent childhood hookworm infection, the economic research would eventually show, depressed adult income by roughly 43%. Every year of infection was a year of lost development. Every child staring blankly at a chalkboard was not failing. She was being failed by a parasite so small and so invisible that no one had thought to look for it. The worm fed on, patient, quiet, invisible, and the world looked at the people it fed upon and called them lazy. Someone was going to have to see this clearly, and seeing it clearly was going to be the loneliest kind of scientific courage, the kind that is not rewarded with praise but with laughter, the kind that survives only in a person with something rarer than intelligence, rarer than training, rarer than ambition, the stubbornness to keep being right even when no one believes you. There are certain kinds of scientific courage that history likes to romanticize. The lone genius, the sudden revelation, the moment when the truth arrives in a blaze of clarity, and the world shifts beneath it. That is not what happened here. What happened here was slower than that, quieter, and considerably more inglorious. Charles Wardell Stiles was born in 1867 in Spring Valley, New York, the son of a Methodist minister who supplemented his modest income as a stenographer. He was, by all accounts, a specific kind of person, precise, methodical, deeply trained, and possessed of a stubbornness that those who admired him called determination, and those who did not called arrogance. He had an aptitude for languages that led him, at 19, to abandon Wesleyan University, after eye trouble interrupted his studies, and travel instead to Europe, where he spent the better part of 6 years, making himself into one of the most rigorously educated parasitologists in the Western world. Paris, Göttingen, Berlin, Leipzig, where he earned his doctorate in 1890 under Rudolf Leuckart, one of the great helminthologists of the age. Then the Austrian Zoological Station at Trieste, then the Institut Pasteur in Paris. He came back to the United States in 1891, deeply fluent in the science of parasitic worms and carrying with him a piece of European knowledge that American medicine had not yet absorbed. The understanding that hookworm was not merely a disease of tropical miners and Italian tunnel workers, but a condition that could thrive anywhere the climate was warm enough and the sanitation poor enough. In the Swiss and German mining regions, hookworm had already caused epidemic anemia among workers in the Gotthard Tunnel in 1880, a fact that European physicians had by then worked out with some precision. The German public health system, by the time Stiles was studying in Leipzig in the late 1880s, already understood hookworm. It had been in their medical textbooks for years. American medicine, by contrast, had not looked. Stiles joined the Bureau of Animal Industry at the Department of Agriculture in Washington, cataloging intestinal parasites of cattle and poultry, and he waited, as scientists sometimes must, for the right moment to ask the question that was quietly assembling itself in his mind. The question concerned the American South. He had noted the climate. He had noted the poverty. He had noted the barefoot farming communities and the inadequate sanitation and the warm, humid earth. He had noted all the conditions that he knew from his European training were necessary for hookworm to thrive. And he had filed the observation away, because he did not yet have sufficient evidence to do more than wonder. The evidence arrived, as so many important things do, from an unexpected direction. His former student, Bailey Ashford, had gone to Puerto Rico in 1898 as an Army medical officer during the American occupation that followed the Spanish-American War. What Ashford found there was an island in which the leading cause of death and debilitation was not a tropical fever or a battle wound, but an overwhelming population-wide anemia. Pale, exhausted people crowding the relief tents, their bodies depleted in a way that baffled the conventional military medical mind. Ashford looked at his patient's stool samples under a microscope and found hookworm eggs in enormous quantities. He began treating with hymol, a compound derived from the herb thyme, long used in European medicine as a vermifuge, followed by Epsom salts to flush the dead worms from the intestine. Within 24 to 48 hours, patients who had been barely able to stand were sitting up. Ashford eventually treated approximately 300,000 people in Puerto Rico, roughly a third of the island's entire population, and reduced the death rate from hookworm-associated anemia by 90%. When the samples and the reports from Puerto Rico reached Stiles, he felt something click into place that had been building in him for years. The climate of Puerto Rico and the climate of the American South were not dissimilar. The conditions of poverty, bare feet, inadequate sanitation. He had observed these himself in his limited travels through the southern states. He had seen the pale children and the hollow-eyed adults and the swollen bellies, and he had heard the word laziness applied to them. And something in his rigorously trained scientific mind had quietly resisted that explanation without yet having a better one to offer. Now he had one, or rather, now he knew precisely where to look. In the autumn of 1902, Stiles transferred from the Department of Agriculture to the U.S. Public Health Service and arranged what he described in his own later writing as a Southern survey trip. He traveled through Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina, Florida, and Texas, carrying his microscope and his collection equipment and his growing conviction. Everywhere he stopped, at farms, at small clinics, in communities where the dirt eaters were known to local physicians and attributed variously to strange habits or inexplicable appetite. He collected stool samples and examined them, and everywhere, without exception, he found what he was looking for: hookworm eggs, millions of them, in county after county, in community after community, in the feces of pale and exhausted people who had no idea they were carrying anything at all. He was, by his own account, much astonished, not at the presence of the parasite. By this point, he had expected to find it. He was astonished at the scale, at how utterly pervasive it was, at how completely it explained what he had been seeing all around him. Not a moral failing, not a racial characteristic, not the inherited torpor that newspapers and politicians had been diagnosing from a comfortable distance for decades. A disease, a specific, identifiable, treatable disease, one that could, he calculated with his characteristic precision, be cured at a cost of approximately 50 cents worth of thymol and salts per person. 50 cents. He kept returning to that number, the way a person returns to something that both astonishes and grieves them. 50 cents to restore a child to health. 50 cents to give back to an exhausted sharecropper the physical capacity to work his land and think clearly about his life. 50 cents, combined with some basic changes to sanitation and the wearing of shoes, and the South's great invisible epidemic could be broken. He went back to Washington. In December of 1902, he stood before the annual meeting of the Pan-American Sanitary Conference and said, quietly and with considerable precision, what he had found. He said that the condition of the poor white Southerner, long assumed to be a function of character and breeding, was, in his professional assessment, primarily a medical problem. He said that hookworm was the most common infectious disease in the South. He said it was more prevalent than malaria. He said it was treatable, cheaply and effectively, and that the treatment was already proven in Puerto Rico. He named the parasite he had identified as a distinct American species, Necator Americanus, the American murderer. He said all of this calmly, with the confident specificity of a man whose evidence is solid. The next morning, the New York Sun published a headline that Stiles would remember for the rest of his life. Germ of laziness found. With the question mark, doing most of the work. The story did not treat his findings as a medical revelation. It treated them as comedy. The notion that Southern laziness, that great, entrenched, beloved cultural shorthand for an entire region's character, was caused by a worm was, to the Northern press, simply too good a joke to take seriously. The word hookworm entered the popular vocabulary attached to laughter. Stiles became, in the papers that picked up the story, a figure of fun. He was aghast at what had been made of his work. He was being trivialized by hookworm jokes in the same breath as the discovery that could save millions of people. In the South, the reaction was different and considerably angrier. Southern pride in 1902 was a complicated and tender thing. The region had spent nearly 40 years being characterized by the North as backward, defeated, culturally inferior. And here was a Yankee scientist, trained in European universities, suggesting that the South had a health problem, and that this health problem explained its most notorious characteristic. The implication, even if Stiles had not intended it that way, was that Southern white poverty was not the result of difficult history and structural economic forces, but of a worm that the South's people had been too ignorant or too dirty to prevent. Southern physicians, many of whom had spent their careers treating the conditions that Stiles was now attributing to hookworm, found his claims implausible at best and insulting at worst. Some said so publicly, some wrote letters, some wrote editorials, and Southern politicians who understood that the narrative of the lazy Southerner was already doing enough damage to the region's reputation without a zoologist in Washington adding parasitology to the indictment, made clear that they were not interested in outside interference. One contemporary medical account summarized the moment plainly. The ridicule and indignation of the country turned against Stiles because of his claim that the tenant white problem was primarily a medical problem, and that hookworms were at the basis of the condition of these people. He had made the mistake of being right about something that a great many powerful people had very strong reasons to resist. And so Stiles kept going. This is the part of the story that deserves to be held carefully, because it is easy to say that someone persevered and much harder to understand what that actually costs over years. He prepared lantern slide presentations, the equivalent in the early 20th century of a carefully produced lecture with projected images, and he showed them to anyone who would sit through them. Town officials, state legislators, university presidents, health boards, medical societies. He was received sometimes with polite skepticism, sometimes with open hostility, and occasionally, as some Southern physicians began quietly finding hookworm in their own patients and confirming what he had said, with a grudging partial agreement that did not quite translate into action. His own agency, the Public Health Service, did not consider the problem pressing enough to fund a proper campaign. Private medicine was not moved. The federal government looked elsewhere. And Stiles, who was brilliant at parasitology and sometimes clumsy as a political advocate, he helped mill owners enforce treatment on their workers without understanding why he was simultaneously alienating labor, continued nonetheless, carrying his conviction and his slides and his 50-cent cure through a landscape that did not yet want them. 6 years. From 1902 to 1908. 6 years of lantern slides and polite skepticism and newspaper jokes. And the worm fed on undisturbed, and the children sat pale and still on their porch steps across the red clay South, and the world called it laziness. And then, in the November of 1908, everything changed in the way that large things sometimes change. Not through a dramatic confrontation or a legislative victory, but through a casual remark on a train platform, to the right man at exactly the right moment. President Theodore Roosevelt had appointed Stiles to his Commission on Country Life, a body charged with studying the conditions of rural America. He was traveling with 2 fellow commission members, Henry Wallace, an Iowan agricultural journalist, and Walter Hines Page, a North Carolina native who had built a distinguished career in Boston and New York as a publisher and writer, and who carried within him the complicated, wounded love that expatriate Southerners often hold for the region they have left. Page knew the South's poverty intimately. He had written about it. He had given a famous address years earlier about the forgotten men and women of the rural South, and he had spent much of his adult life searching for some lever of redemption powerful enough to lift what the history of slavery and war had left behind. The train was stopped somewhere in the South. On the platform outside, leaning against the station wall, was a man, a figure so thoroughly shaped by his condition that he had become almost an emblem of it. Pale, slack, slightly misshapen in the way that severe chronic anemia reshapes a body over years of quiet depletion. He was propped rather than standing. His eyes had that glassy somewhere else quality that Stiles had learned to read as clearly as a diagnostic text. Henry Wallace, who had never seen such a thing, noticed him first. "What on earth is that?" Walter Page said quietly. "That is a so-called poor white." "If he represents Southern farm labor," Wallace replied, "the South is in poor luck." And then Stiles, looking at that man on the platform and seeing, with 6 years of accumulated evidence and unacknowledged certainty, exactly what was wrong with him, said simply, "That man is a dirt eater. His condition is due to hookworm infection. He can be cured at a cost of about 50 cents for drugs. In a few weeks, he could be turned into a useful man. Walter Page turned from the window. Something shifted in that moment. Not yet the campaign, not yet the $1 million, not yet the dispensaries in 11 southern states, and the county-by-county surveys, and the schools filling with children who could finally stay awake long enough to learn. But the first hinge. Page was a man with connections to the philanthropic networks of New York, to the General Education Board, to the people who moved in the orbit of the most powerful industrialist in America. That evening, Page introduced Stiles to Wallace Buttrick, secretary of the General Education Board. The two men went back to Buttrick's hotel room and talked hookworm for most of the night. Stiles showed his slides. He laid out his evidence. He made his argument one more time, the same argument he had been making for 6 years, and Buttrick, unlike so many who had come before him, listened without irony and was convinced. A telegram came to Washington shortly afterward, summoning Stiles to New York for a meeting with Frederick Gates, John D. Rockefeller's chief philanthropic advisor, and Simon Flexner of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. Stiles gave his presentation, 40 minutes of slides and evidence and numbers, and the name Necator Americanus, and the figure of 50 cents a cure. Gates interrupted him, brought another advisor into the room, said, "This is the biggest proposition ever put up to the Rockefeller office. Start from the beginning." The sessions lasted 2 days, 6 years of silence, 6 years of lantern slides and newspaper mockery and polite dismissal. And at the end of it, the biggest philanthropic proposition ever presented to the Rockefeller office. The man on the platform did not know that his body had become the argument that finally worked. The pale man propped against the station wall, not lazy, not congenitally, inferior, not a figure of comedy or contempt, just sick, measurably, treeably, heartbreakingly sick. Stiles had known it for 6 years. Now, finally, someone with $1 million was prepared to agree with him. And what happened next? The particular difficulty of delivering that $1 million to a region that distrusted both the money and the man behind it. That is where the story grows complicated in the most instructive way. Let us pause before we go further on a problem. The problem is this. The man with the money was the wrong man for the South. John D. Rockefeller, in the autumn of 1909, was not merely wealthy. He was the wealthiest human being who had ever lived on American soil. A man whose Standard Oil empire had, at its peak, controlled approximately 90% of all oil refining in the United States, whose fortune was estimated at somewhere between $900 million and $1 billion at a time, when the entire federal budget of the United States government was less than $1 billion a year. He was, in the language of the era, a robber baron. And that language was not merely rhetorical. He had been investigated, prosecuted, and condemned. Ida Tarbell's devastating series of articles on Standard Oil's business practices had been running in McClure's magazine since 1902, and the portrait they drew was unsparing. A man who had crushed competitors through secret railroad rebates, driven small independent refiners out of business by manipulation and coercion, and built his empire on the ruins of others' livelihoods. Some churches refused his donations because his money was considered corrupt at its source. His name, in certain quarters, carried the specific weight of something built on extraction, on the taking of something that belonged to others and repackaging it as wealth. And now that man wanted to give $1 million to the American South. The South, which had spent 40 years being lectured at by northern industrialists. The South, which had been invaded and occupied and reconstructed and found wanting by the very civilization that men like Rockefeller represented. The South, which carried a cultural pride so acute and so tender that the suggestion of outside help landed reliably as the suggestion of outside contempt. A Texas governor, when the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission approached his state in 1910, put the matter with a bluntness that summarized the regional sentiment with almost poetic compression. Texas, he said, could better endure the hookworm than lay itself debtor to Rockefeller. The state attorneys general of South Carolina and Mississippi launched formal investigations into whether the commission was operating legally within their borders. A prominent Louisiana physician denounced the campaign as an insult to Southern medical honor, claiming that Southern doctors knew their patients and did not require a Yankee zoologist and a Northern oil fortune to diagnose the South's poor. And running beneath all of this formal resistance was a quieter, more diffuse unease that the hookworm diagnosis was not really a medical finding at all, but another version of the same old northern narrative, the story that the South was backward, diseased, in need of rescue by its betters. Even when the rescuer had Stiles's evidence and Rose's diplomacy and 50 cents worth of proven cure, the rescue itself felt, to many, like an accusation. This was the political terrain into which the campaign had to move. Frederick Gates, the man who had listened to Stiles for 2 days in New York and declared it the biggest proposition ever put to the Rockefeller office, understood the problem clearly. The solution he arrived at was elegantly indirect. The money would be given, the work would be done, but the architecture of the campaign would be constructed in such a way that Rockefeller's name would appear as little as possible in the South, and the face of the effort, its public voice, its field agents, its daily authority, would belong to men who were not Northerners and not industrialists, but Southerners themselves. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission for the Eradication of Hookworm Disease was formally organized on October 26, 1909. Its board included Stiles, Gates, Walter Hines Page, a handful of university presidents and educators drawn largely from Southern institutions, and John D. Rockefeller, Jr., who appeared on the letterhead as a quiet institutional presence rather than a commanding one. Its offices were established not in New York, where the money lived, but in Washington, where a federal address gave the enterprise a national rather than a specifically Northern identity. And its executive secretary, the man chosen to run the actual operations of the campaign, to make the daily decisions about where teams went and how they worked and how they presented themselves to the communities they entered, was a man named Wycliffe Rose. Rose was, in almost every measurable way, the opposite of Charles Wardell Stiles. Where Stiles was angular and sometimes tactless, Rose was smooth and meticulous. Where Stiles had a scientist's directness that occasionally offended the people he was trying to persuade, Rose had an administrator's genius for making things happen without ever appearing to push them. He was the son of a cotton-farming Tennessee preacher, born in 1862 in Salisbury, Tennessee, which meant he was Southern in the deepest and most politically useful sense. He understood the region's temperament from the inside, knew its pride and its sensitivities, knew exactly which tone of voice and which manner of approach was least likely to raise the defenses of a southern county health official or a suspicious rural parent. He had worked for years in southern education, and the historian who studied him most closely described him as a man who took genuine satisfaction in anonymity, who had buried his origins under a meticulous persona, who stood out from his colleagues most noticeably for his deep-seated reluctance to stand out at all. Rose understood immediately that the campaign could not succeed as an imposition. It could not arrive looking like a Yankee invasion or a philanthropic condescension or a medical lecture from above. It had to look, and to the greatest extent possible, actually be, a Southern effort, led by Southern men, supported by Southern institutions, serving Southern people. His first formal gesture was a letter to the governor of every Southern state, asking not for permission, but for partnership. The work, his letter made clear, would happen only with state cooperation and only through state health infrastructure. If the infection is to be stamped out, the first annual report would state, with deliberate care, the states in which it exists must assume the responsibility. This was not just good politics. It was, in the long run, the Commission's most significant structural achievement. The recognition that a 5-year campaign funded by a single philanthropist could not, by itself, produce permanent change. What it could do was help build the public health infrastructure that Southern states needed to maintain the work after the Commission's money ran out. But first, the campaign had to prove its case in the field. Rose recruited his state-level field agents with surgical precision. They were, almost without exception, young and native Southerners, men who could walk into a rural county without triggering the alarm that a Northern voice or a New York address would have raised. They knew the landscape. They knew how to speak to farmers and school superintendents and county boards of health in the particular idiom that Southern communities required. And they carried with them, in addition to their microscopes and their treatment supplies, an approach to the work that Rose had borrowed from Bailey Ashford's model in Puerto Rico, the traveling dispensary. A dispensary, in Rose's design, was not a clinic in the formal sense. It was a community event, part medical intervention and part public education, designed to be accessible and, even within the limits of the subject matter, gently engaging. Teams would arrive in a county, set up their equipment in a schoolhouse or a church hall or beneath a shade tree at a crossroads gathering place, and invite Never compel, families to bring their children for testing. The testing was simple. A stool sample, examined under a microscope, could reveal hookworm eggs in minutes. The results were immediate and visible. A microscope was set up so that parents and children could look through the eyepiece and see, in the samples from their own bodies, the oval, thin-shelled evidence of an infestation they had never suspected. Lantern slides were projected on white sheets showing the life cycle of the parasite. Educational pamphlets were distributed. The RSC even produced an illustrated children's book, The Story of a Boy, showing in simple pictures how the worm entered bare feet, what it did inside the body, and what wearing shoes and using an outhouse could prevent. The early resistance was real and sometimes fierce. In some communities, the suggestion that a community's children might be hosting intestinal parasites was received as an insult to the community's dignity, an implication of filthiness, of inadequate parenting, of a failure of cleanliness that people did not wish to have named publicly by an outside agency. Some parents organized and pushed back. The concern that the entire operation was a scheme to sell shoes to Southerners on behalf of Northern manufacturers a theory that circulated with surprising persistence through the more suspicious communities, was not entirely rational in its underlying distrust, even if its specific logic was strained. Suspicion of northern money and northern motives had been earned through decades of experience. Even in Wilmington, after parents discovered that the Commission's testing revealed their children had been exposed to fecal contamination, the community's response was not gratitude but outrage, not at the parasite, but at the messengers who had named it. Stiles, characteristically, was delighted. He wrote to Rose that the parents' indignation would lead to better sanitation. Rose, characteristically, did not respond with enthusiasm. Public indignation was not his model. Quiet persuasion was, but the data, as it accumulated, was harder to argue with than any political resistance. The Necator surveyed over 600 counties across 11 southern states between 1910 and 1914. The microscopes did not care about politics. They found eggs, or they did not find eggs. And what they found, county after county, state after state, was what Charles Wardell Stiles had been saying for 8 years. Roughly 40% of all school-age children tested were infected with hookworm, not in the worst counties. As an average, across hundreds of communities that had attributed their children's paleness and lethargy to anything but the correct explanation. In some individual counties, the rate climbed far higher, 50, 60%, in the most heavily infected areas, approaching 3 children in every 4. In Arkansas alone, testing revealed that 25% of all school-aged children in the state were infected. In counties where the red clay soil stayed warm and moist through long southern summers, and the outhouses were absent, and the paths ran barefoot between fields and wells, the eggs were everywhere. The numbers, laid out in the Commission's annual reports, had a cumulative weight that was difficult to dismiss when more than half the children in a county's schools were carrying a blood-draining parasite. The hypothesis that the South's problems were primarily a matter of character became, as a practical matter, untenable. And then the treatments began. The cure was what it had always been, what Ashford had used in Puerto Rico, what Stiles had been insisting could be obtained for 50 cents. Thymol administered orally acted to loosen the hookworm's attachment to the intestinal wall. Epsom salts, taken afterward, flushed the loosened worms from the body. The whole process took 24 to 48 hours. It was not comfortable. The combination produced cramps and purging, but it was rapid, it was inexpensive, and for the people who experienced it, the change was sometimes remarkable enough to be described, by those who witnessed it, with something that approached disbelief. School superintendents who had spent years watching children sit vacant-eyed through their lessons began writing letters. They had not understood, they said, that the children were sick. They had thought the children were simply dull. A superintendent in Wilkes County, North Carolina, wrote to report that after the treatment campaign moved through his district, the quality of performance in the county schools was raised considerably. More than 50% of his pupils had been infected. Treatment cured the majority. One girl in 5th grade, too pale, too exhausted to finish the school term, was treated and returned. She finished the term at the top of her class. At the top of her class. She had been there all along. The capacity had always been there, waiting beneath the fog of oxygen-starved blood and the relentless quiet drain of dozens of cutting plate mouths on the wall of her gut. She had not needed a lecture on effort or a sermon on character. She had needed 50 cents worth of thymol and a glass of water. Rose's campaign also insisted on something Stiles had not managed to communicate effectively in his years of solo advocacy. The cure was only half the work. A child dewormed in the spring would be reinfected by autumn if she still walked barefoot in soil contaminated by the feces of infected neighbors. The two interventions that mattered for prevention were as simple as they were, in a region of deep poverty and cultural habit. Complicated: shoes and outhouses. Shoes to break the transmission at the point of contact, outhouses to prevent human feces, and the hookworm eggs it carried. From contaminating the soil in the first place, not technologically demanding, socially and economically demanding, in a region where poverty was profound, and the suggestion that people needed to change their most intimate habits was received, not unreasonably, as personal criticism. Rose's teams approached even this with care. The public health education was woven into the dispensary events without the tone of condemnation. The language was illness, not filth, disease, not deficiency, and wherever possible, the appeal was to what people loved: their children, their communities, the possibility of a South that was healthy and whole. The campaign treated more than 700,000 individuals over its 5-year run. It did not eradicate the parasite. The commission acknowledged as much, and Rose crumbled when Gates decided in 1913 that it was time to wind the Southern operation down and turn the commission's ambitions toward global health work. Eradication had been the stated goal. Eradication had not been achieved, but the data was beginning to shift. School attendance was rising in the treated counties. Literacy was improving. The early signs of what later researchers would quantify: faster income growth in heavily treated areas, rising returns to schooling, the first measurable closing of a developmental gap that the worm had enforced for generations, were beginning to appear in the census numbers. And the South, slowly, without quite admitting it, was beginning to build the public health infrastructure that Rose had always intended the commission to leave behind. 4 states had functional public health boards with legal authority and actual budgets when the campaign began. By the time it ended, that number had grown considerably. Rose had used the hookworm, that invisible, inglorious 50-cent problem, as an opening wedge, a reason for Southern communities to care about public health in a way they never had, and a demonstration that caring about it actually changed something. The worm was not gone, but the South had looked at it for the first time clearly. And the looking, the act of finally naming what had always been there, had already begun to change the world beneath the bare feet of its children. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the end of a long injustice. Not the silence of peace. That comes later, if it comes at all. This is the silence of reckoning, of looking at what was lost and trying to hold the full weight of it without flinching. The reckoning in this case came nearly a century after the campaign. It came in the form of an Economist Journal article published in 2007 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics by a researcher named Hoyt Bleakley, a man who had spent years carefully matching the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission's hookworm survey data against the U.S. Census records of the children who had lived through those years, and the adults those children had become, and the wages those adults had earned, and the schools those children had or had not attended. The numbers, when he found them, were staggering. And they were staggering not because they were large in some abstract global sense, but because they were so precise, because they could be put in a table and analyzed and compared, because they attached specific magnitudes to a specific suffering, because they answered, with the cold authority of data, the question that the lazy Southerner stereotype had never once thought to ask: what exactly did this cost? Let us take the question slowly. The first place to look is the schoolroom. In the years immediately following the Commission's campaign, between the 1910 and 1920 census, which bracket the intervention almost perfectly, Bleakley found something that should not have been surprising, but was nonetheless striking in its clarity. Counties that had entered the campaign with higher rates of hookworm infection experienced substantially larger gains in school enrollment, school attendance, and child literacy than counties that had been less infected. Not gradually, not over decades, between one census and the next. In the space of 10 years, the years during which the dispensaries moved through the counties, and the thymol was administered, and the worms were flushed from the bodies of the children, the association between high hookworm burden and low school attendance that had held steady across census after census, decade after decade, suddenly and sharply disappeared. A child infected with hookworm had been, on average, 20 percentage points less likely to be enrolled in school than a child without infection. After eradication, that gap closed. Counties with 50% infection rates before the campaign saw school enrollment rise by 3 to 5 percentage points and attendance by 6 to 8 percentage points relative to counties where the parasite had never taken the same hold. These are not dramatic numbers in isolation, but they are real numbers measured against real children in real counties, and what they represent is a generation of children who were finally able to be present in a classroom in a way that the worm had previously made impossible. The schoolroom superintendents had seen it first in the letters they wrote to Rose and Stiles during the campaign years. One superintendent after another had noted, with a kind of startled honesty, that children who had been treated were simply performing differently than they had before. Children who had struggled to complete a term were now finishing it. Children who had sat glassy-eyed through lessons were now raising their hands. There is one letter that is worth returning to, because it contains within it the whole of the argument compressed into a single fact. The superintendent of schools in Wilkes County, North Carolina, wrote to report that after the Commission's dispensaries had moved through his district, the quality of performance in the county schools had been raised considerably. He had tested his pupils. More than 50% had been infected with hookworm. Treatment cured the majority of these cases. And then he mentioned one child specifically, a girl in 5th grade who had been too pale and too exhausted to finish the school term. She had been treated. She had returned. She had finished the term at the top of her class. At the top of her class. She had been there all along. The capacity had always been hers. The intelligence, the curiosity, the ability to read and reason and remember. All of it had been present, waiting in a body whose blood was no longer carrying enough oxygen to let the brain that held all of it function properly. She had needed nothing that the world had withheld from her by malice or ideology. She had needed 50 cents worth of thymol and a glass of water, and someone who understood that her slowness was not her own. The data from the census confirmed a decade later what those letters had described. The treatment had worked. The fog had lifted. where there had been what the world called dullness and slowness, and the particular vacant quality of a child whose body is not receiving enough oxygen to power its learning, there was now simply a child, an ordinary child, capable of ordinary learning, doing what children do when no one is draining them from within. The girl in Wilkes County was not exceptional. She was representative. Hundreds of thousands of children across the treated counties were, in the years following the campaign, discovering the same thing, that the capacity had been there all along, waiting beneath the fog of the worm's patient work, waiting for someone to name the thief and take it out. Literacy followed enrollment. The ability to read, which requires at a minimum the sustained attention and cognitive function that severe chronic anemia systematically removes, rose in the treated counties in the census decade following the campaign. The counties where the worm had been heaviest and where the treatment had therefore made the largest biological difference showed the largest gains. The relationship between high pre-treatment hookworm burden and low literacy, which had been one of the defining features of the Southern educational landscape for decades, began to loosen. And the children who had been treated, what happened to them when they grew up? This is where the data becomes genuinely haunting, because it reaches forward across decades into the 1940 census and the income records of adults who had been children during the campaign years. And it finds something that carries, if you let it fully in, the weight of an entire moral argument. Persistent childhood hookworm infection, the kind of long-term, year-after-year infection that had characterized the rural South for generations, depressed adult wage earning capacity by approximately 43%. 43%. For every year a child spent infected during the developmental years, the economists estimated a loss of roughly 2.2% of adult earning potential. Not because the worm damaged the brain permanently, not because it created some irreversible deficit, but because a child who cannot concentrate cannot learn, and a child who cannot learn arrives at adulthood with less human capital than she would have had, less literacy, less numeracy, less of the foundation on which economic life is built. And the gap compounds across a lifetime. 43%. Consider what that means at the level of a region. The South in the early 20th century was, by almost every economic measure, the poorest and least developed part of the United States. The gap between Southern wages and Northern wages had been debated, analyzed, and attributed to dozens of causes. To the legacy of slavery, to the plantation economy's structural distortions, to the failure of Reconstruction, to cultural attitudes toward education, to the heat, to the history. And all of these explanations contained genuine truth. None of them was wrong, but the hookworm data added something to the picture that no one had properly quantified before. A portion of the South's developmental lag was not cultural or structural or historical in the usual sense. It was biological. It was a parasite, living in the warm soil, entering through bare feet, attaching to intestinal walls, and subtracting at the rate of 2.2% per infected year, the economic future of an entire region's children. The counties that had been most heavily infected before the campaign, the ones where the worms had been most pervasive, where the angle between pre-treatment and post-treatment conditions was steepest, saw adult income in the cohorts exposed to the campaign as children grew at roughly 12 to 15% faster than income grew in counties where the parasite had never taken the same hold. 12 to 15% faster. In an era when the South was trying desperately to close the economic distance between itself and the industrializing North, that differential represented not just wages, but the difference between a region that was catching up and a region that had been held back by something it did not know was there. These numbers arrived nearly a century after the campaign, which means that the full economic cost of the hookworm epidemic was not calculated until roughly 100 years after Charles Wardell Stiles stood before the Pan-American Sanitary Conference in Washington and said quietly and precisely that the South's problem was medical, not moral. 100 years, the data that would have vindicated him most completely, did not exist in a form that could be analyzed until after almost everyone involved was long dead. Think about what that century contained. Think about the children born in the 1880s, who grew up infected and who are accounted for in those numbers. The 2.2% per year, the 43% total, the wages they did not earn, and the schools they could not finish, and the futures that were smaller than they should have been. Think about their children, born in the early 20th century into the same red clay world, the same barefoot poverty, the same warm soil with its patient invisible residents. The campaign reached some of them. It reached 700,000 of them, directly with its dispensaries and its 50-cent cures. But there were millions of children in the rural South in that era, and each commission was 5 years old and funded by a single $1 million gift, and the math was not generous. Some were reached, many were not, and the ones who were not reached lived their lives and passed their poverty on, and the worm lived in the soil and passed itself on. And the century turned, and the New Deal came, and the mechanization of southern agriculture drove the sharecroppers from the land, and the Great Migration moved millions north. And in the process of all those enormous historical movements, the hookworm became, in most accounts, a historical curiosity, a disease that had been defeated, a problem that had been solved, a chapter that was closed. It was not closed. That is what the last section of this story will tell you. But for now, let us sit with the data a moment longer. There is something in that delay that belongs to the story. It is the same delay that allowed the parasite to feed undisturbed for generations before Stiles identified it. It is the same delay that made the newspapers laugh in 1902. Injustice moves faster than understanding, and understanding moves faster than reckoning, and reckoning almost never arrives in time to help the people who needed it most. But the data is there now. And it says what it says. Let us say it plainly. A child in a heavily infected southern county in 1905 was 20 percentage points less likely to be in school than her counterpart in an uninfected county. She was 13 percentage points less likely to be literate. If she reached adulthood, and hookworm, though it rarely killed directly, increased vulnerability to every other infection that passed through her community and raised maternal mortality rates meaningfully, she would earn roughly 43% less over her working life than she would have earned had the worm not been there. She would live in a county whose tax base was smaller, whose schools were worse funded, whose public institutions were weaker than they would have been if the 50-cent cure had been available a generation earlier. All of this because the world had found it easier to call her lazy than to look at the soil beneath her feet. The campaign itself, the 5 years of dispensaries and lantern slides and thymol and Epsom salts and Wycliffe Rose's careful diplomatic architecture, did not undo all of this. It could not have. The adults who had already grown up infected, who had already passed through their developmental years with the worm in residence, who had already arrived at adulthood with whatever the chronic anemia had taken from them. Those people were largely beyond the reach of any intervention that worked through childhood development. The data confirmed it. There were no significant contemporaneous economic effects on adults during the campaign years. The worm's damage to adult capacity had already been done before the dispensaries arrived. The greatest benefits flowed to the children treated before those losses had fully accumulated, and to the generations born into a world where the parasite's hold on the southern soil had been loosened, even if not broken. This is one of the bittersweet truths of the hookworm story. The cure was genuine. The improvement was real. The numbers confirming it are clear. But the improvement took a generation to register fully, because the human brain develops on a timeline that does not compress, and the economic returns to that development manifest across an adult lifetime. And the full accounting only becomes possible when you can look back across decades at what the children became. The RSC's 5-year campaign also left things undone that belong in any honest accounting. The Commission's attention to black Southerners, who were equally infected, equally suffering, and arguably more deeply impoverished than poor white Southerners, was limited and inconsistent. The campaign's formal interventions in most states were designed with white communities as their primary concern. Some physicians within the RSC network argued that black Southerners had acquired partial immunity through generations of exposure. Others simply did not prioritize the black communities within their counties. The hookworm did not discriminate by race. The public health response, shaped by the Jim Crow world it operated in, largely did. That exclusion sits alongside the campaign's genuine achievements in any honest reckoning, and it matters, because the communities that were most excluded from the campaign's benefits were often the communities that would be found a century later still carrying the parasite. And it left the parasite in the soil. The hookworm was never eradicated. The Commission's name had promised eradication. The Commission had failed to deliver it, and had acknowledged as much before its work was done. The worm had been pushed back, its prevalence reduced, its density lowered, the worst of its generational damage interrupted. But in the counties where poverty was deepest, where shoes were still scarce and sanitation still inadequate, where the conditions that had allowed the parasite to establish itself over 2 centuries had not fundamentally changed because a commission had come through with microscopes and moved on. In those places, the worm persisted, quietly, patiently, the way it had always persisted. The laziness was always a diagnosis. That truth had been established now, had been measured, had been written into the economic literature in terms that could not be dismissed. A child infected with hookworm was 20 percentage points less likely to be in school. A county with 50% infection saw a 6 to 8 point surge in attendance once treatment came. Adult wages in the most treated areas grew 12 to 15% faster than in areas the campaign had never reached. Chronic childhood infection had suppressed adult earning capacity by 43%, 2.2% for every year the worm was present. These are the numbers. They are what the stereotype had cost. And the injustice was not that the cure was difficult. It was not that the science was unclear. It was not that anyone lacked the intelligence to solve the problem. The injustice was that the cure was 50 cents, and had been 50 cents all along, and the world had chosen for decades and generations and the better part of a century to call it laziness, instead of looking at the soil, instead of asking what lived there, instead of doing the simple, unglamorous 50-cent work of naming what was actually wrong. The reckoning comes late. It always does. But it comes. The year is 2017. More than a century has passed since Charles Wardell Stiles collected his stool samples in the warm counties of the American South and came back to Washington with his evidence and his 50-cent cure, and his growing certainty that the South's great reputation for laziness was, in fact, a diagnosis waiting to be made. A century, during which the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission came and went, during which the New Deal remade the Southern economy in ways that lifted millions out of subsistence agriculture and into something closer to modern life, during which the Second World War industrialized the region, during which the civil rights movement fought and bled and sometimes died for the right of black Southerners to vote and to be treated as full human beings in the land their ancestors had built, during which the hookworm faded from the medical literature and from public memory and from the conversation about what the American South was and why. In 2017, a team of researchers from the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine traveled to Lowndes County, Alabama, and asked a simple question: is the hookworm still here? Lowndes County sits in the heart of Alabama's Black Belt, that band of southern states named for its rich, dark soil, the same fertile earth that had made it one of the great cotton-growing regions of the antebellum South, and that had, for the same reasons of warmth and moisture and clay content, always been hospitable to Necator Americanus. The county has approximately 11,000 residents. 74% are African American. Nearly a third of the population lives below the poverty line. The average annual income is $18,046, 24 miles from the county courthouse to the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery. 24 miles. That is the distance between a community where 1 in 3 people will test positive for a 19th century parasite, one long believed to have been eradicated from the United States, and the seat of the government of the state in which they live. 24 miles, and the distance might as well be measured in centuries. The county has a long history of deliberate exclusion. It earned the name Bloody Lowndes for the violence with which its white population opposed any attempt by its black majority to exercise political power. Violence so systematic and so overwhelming that in 1965, when the Selma to Montgomery March passed through Lowndes County along U.S. Highway 80, the county had 0 registered black voters, despite a population that was more than 80% black. 0. The marchers who walked through it on their way to petition the state government for the right to vote had to sleep in tent cities in fields because there was nowhere else for them to stop. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, moved by what they found in Lowndes County, later organized the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, whose symbol was a Black Panther, which would later become nationally famous, specifically to fight for the political rights of the county's black residents. That was 1965. The Voting Rights Act passed the same year. In 2017, 52 years later, the Baylor researchers collected stool samples from Lowndes County residents and tested them for hookworm. Of the 55 samples collected, 34.5% tested positive for Necator Americanus, roughly 1 in 3. The researchers also asked about sanitation. They found that approximately 80% of Lowndes County had no municipal sewer system. Residents were expected to manage their own wastewater with individual septic systems, which in the clay-heavy soil of the Black Belt do not drain efficiently and frequently fail. In the survey, nearly 3/4 of participants reported that raw sewage had at some point washed back into their homes, through toilets, through bathtub drains, through the floor, during periods of heavy rain. Many residents had resorted to what is called straight piping, running a PVC pipe from the toilet directly outside the house, discharging waste into the yard or a nearby ditch. In Lowndes County, Alabama, in 2017, people were using their yards as latrines, and in those yards, in the warm and moist black soil of the Alabama Black Belt, the larvae of Necator Americanus were waiting. Curled in the thin upper layer of the earth, developmentally arrested, sensing warmth and moisture, waiting for a bare foot or an ankle or a child playing close to the ground. The hookworm had not left. It had simply been waiting, patient as it has always been patient, in the soil. Catherine Coleman Flowers, the civil rights activist and founder of the Alabama Center for Rural Enterprise, who had spent years documenting the sanitation crisis in Lowndes County, and who had pressed the Baylor researchers to conduct the study, said afterward that hookworm was a 19th century disease that should by now have been addressed. Yet here it was. Here, 24 miles from the state capital, at the end of the same road that the Selma marchers had walked for the right to vote. Flowers had been visiting homes in Lowndes County since the early 2000s, witnessing conditions that struck her each time as belonging to a different century. Sewage pooled in yards, children playing in the same earth through which untreated wastewater moved after rain. The high clay content of the Black Belt soil, which made conventional septic systems largely ineffective, a geological fact that was known to county and state authorities and had been known for decades, meant that no amount of individual effort could solve the problem without infrastructure investment. Individual families could not build the municipal sewer system that the county lacked. Individual residents could not change the composition of the soil through which their waste failed to drain. The problem was structural, and the solution required exactly what the Rockefeller Sanitary Commission had tried to build a century earlier: public health infrastructure, funded and maintained by institutions with the authority and the resources to sustain it. In 2021, the United States Department of Justice opened a formal investigation into Lowndes County's sanitation conditions, examining whether the failures of state and county health departments to address the situation constituted a violation of the civil rights of the county's black residents. The investigation found that local officials had failed to take meaningful actions to remedy the conditions and had often left residents to fend for themselves. In 2025, that settlement, the legal action that had seemed, after decades of advocacy, to finally represent some reckoning with the structural nature of the problem, was killed by the incoming federal administration. The worm is patient. It has always been patient. And the question that sits in the silence of this history, the question that the whole long story presses toward, is a simple one. It is the same question that it has always been. Not. Why is Lowndes County poor? Not. Why do its residents lack sanitation? Those questions have answers, and the answers are not comfortable, and they have to do with the deliberate exclusion of black Southerners from economic and political life across 2 centuries, with slavery and sharecropping and bloody Lowndes and 0 registered black voters in 1965, and the failure of Reconstruction and the failure of the Commission to include black communities in its treatments, and the failure of state governments to build the infrastructure that would have made the hookworm impossible. The question is simpler than that. The question is, why, when a community is sick, is the first instinct so often to blame the character of the people who are sick? It was laziness in 1902. It was poor breeding. It was the essential inferiority of the Southern poor, which was used to explain everything from their poverty to their illiteracy to the way they sat still on porch steps in the summer heat. And what it was hookworm. What it was a parasite that entered through bare feet and stole iron from the blood and left the brain without the oxygen it needed to do its work. What it was structural poverty so deep that shoes were unaffordable and outhouses were absent and the soil was perpetually contaminated. What it was a problem with a 50-cent solution that the world declined to apply for decades because it was easier to call people lazy than to look at the soil. The hookworm did not care about race. It entered through bare feet, and it fed on blood, and it produced anemia and cognitive fog, and the glassy, distant quality in the eyes that the world read as stupidity or sloth. It did this to white sharecroppers in Georgia, and to black tenant farmers in Alabama, and to the children of both, because the worm knew nothing about the human categories that had organized the suffering so carefully. It only knew warmth and moisture and blood. But the response to the hookworm, the naming of it and the treating of it and the building of the infrastructure to prevent it, was deeply shaped by those human categories. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission focused primarily on white communities. Black communities, though equally infected, were largely outside the formal scope of the campaign's interventions, and a century later, when the disease reappeared in measurable quantities, it appeared in Lowndes County, one of the poorest, blackest, most historically excluded counties in the United States, while the rest of the country had largely moved on to the comfortable belief that the hookworm was a historical problem, safely in the past. It is not in the past. The soil remembers. Necator Americanus is still, as of the most recent global estimates, infecting approximately 500 million people worldwide. Most of them live in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Most of them are poor. Most of them live in places where shoes are scarce, and sanitation is inadequate, and the soil is warm and moist, and the conditions that allow the worm to persist have not been changed, because changing them requires exactly the kind of investment in public health infrastructure that wealthy nations find it easy to defer when the people who need it lack the political power to demand it. The world has given this category of suffering a name now: neglected tropical diseases. The word neglected carries within it a quiet acknowledgement, not that these diseases are unknown, not that medicine lacks the tools to address them, but that the people who have them are not important enough in the calculations of wealth and power to be prioritized. The hookworm is on the list. It has been on the list for decades. The medicine exists. Albendazole and mebendazole, cheap and effective and available. The modern descendants of the thymol and Epsom salts that Bailey Ashford used in Puerto Rico in 1903 and that cost 50 cents a century ago. The prevention is understood. Shoes, sanitation. The political will to build and maintain the infrastructure that keeps human waste out of the soil where bare feet walk. The playbook is a century old. It worked, imperfectly, in the American South. It worked, when applied, in Puerto Rico. It has worked in pockets, in other places and other times. The tools are not mysterious. What is missing has never been the tools. What is missing is not knowledge. What is missing, as it has always been missing, is the willingness to look at a poor community clearly, to see suffering without immediately reaching for a story about the character of the sufferers, to resist the reflex that turns illness into indictment, to understand that the distance between a thriving child and a pale, still, vacant-eyed one is sometimes nothing more than a worm in the soil and a government that declined to fix the drain. Tonight, as you lie in the dark, the story of the hookworm is not quite over. It is still being written in the clay soil of the Alabama Black Belt and in the warm earth of West Africa and Southeast Asia, and 100 other places where poverty and a warm climate and the absence of adequate sanitation have created exactly the conditions that Necator Americanus has spent millions of years learning to exploit. The worm is patient. It does not hurry. It has no agenda beyond its own survival and reproduction, no malice, no design. It simply waits, in the thin upper layer of the soil, for a warm body to come close. The malice, when there is malice, belongs to the systems that make bare feet necessary and outhouses unaffordable. The malice, when there is malice, belongs to the habit of looking at the symptoms of poverty and calling it character. The malice belongs to the newspaper that runs a headline as a joke, to the politician who finds it easier to talk about moral fiber than about municipal sewer systems, to the physician who sees a pale and exhausted child and reaches for the explanation that asks the least of the world around her. The worm is innocent of all of that. The worm is only a worm. It does what it was made to do, with a patience and a precision that is almost beautiful if you can look at it from far enough away, which most of us cannot, when the thing being described is a creature that has spent centuries draining the blood and the futures of the poorest people in the world. What we are not innocent of is the century of laziness jokes, the editorials about Southern character, the decision made again and again in Lowndes County and in 100 places like it, to study the problem and acknowledge the problem and write the reports and open the investigations and then leave the residents to fend for themselves, because fixing it properly would require treating poor black Southerners as people whose health and dignity were worth a significant expenditure of money and political will. Charles Wardell Stiles understood something about this mechanism, though he lacked the language for it that we have now. He understood that when a society is confronted with a large and complex problem that has a simple cause and a cheap solution, the society often prefers the complicated explanation to the simple one, because the complicated explanation, the one about character and breeding and the essential nature of the poor, requires nothing. It does not require infrastructure investment. It does not require public health campaigns or county health officers or traveling dispensaries. It does not require looking at the people who are suffering and taking seriously the possibility that their suffering has a cause and that the cause is yours to address. He carried his 50-cent cure through the South for 6 years, and the world called him a fool, and he kept going. That is the thing about Stiles that belongs at the end of this story. Not his discovery, though the discovery was genuine and important. Not his persistence, though the persistence was real and costly. What belongs at the end is the quality of attention he brought to the problem. the willingness to look at poor people clearly, without the filter of contempt, and to ask what was actually wrong. That quality of attention, the refusal to reach for the comfortable explanation, the insistence on looking at the evidence no matter where it leads, is what separated Stiles from the people who laughed at him. It is not complicated, it is not heroic in the dramatic sense. It is simply the decision to look at what is actually there, rather than what is convenient to see. The girl in Wilkes County finished top of her class. She had been there all along. The child on the porch step in Georgia, still and pale in the summer morning, was not lazy. She was never lazy. She was sick in the quiet, patient, invisible way that the hookworm makes people sick. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself as a crisis, but slowly, cumulatively, one small bloodless measure at a time, until the light in the eyes goes somewhere distant, and the world mistakes the distance for an absence of intelligence or will. She was not absent. She was being drained, and the soil she sat above, the warm red Georgia clay pressing against the boards of that porch, carried in its thin upper layer the thing that was draining her, curled, invisible, waiting for the next bare foot, patient as only something without a mind can be patient, which is to say, absolutely and without end. It is still there. The soil remembers. Good night.